Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Before we begin, I want to thank the Istanbul Ilm ve Kültür Vakfı for arranging this event at the Eyüp Sultan Belediyesi, a place of fond memories for me. And I particularly want to thank my dear friend and brother of many years, Professor Faris Kaya, for making me an offer I could not refuse to speak to this group of students and friends of Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, which for me is the best of audiences. 55 years ago today, on March 23rd, actually, this is the 24th of March, 1960, Bediüzzaman Said Nursi died in Urfa. He had traveled there from Isparta to the ancient city in Upper Mesopotamia, along with a handful of followers in a metallic gold Chevrolet. There, in a humble room at the İpek Palace Hotel, he breathed his last. In that same room, the clock stands stopped at the hour of his death. The following day, under a light rain, he was buried in the Halilur Rahman Dergah, next to the sacred pool that reminds believers of God's rescue of the father of monotheism. The Quran says of the flames kindled by the idol worshipper King Nimrod, "Let the fire be coolness for Abraham." A few weeks later, after the coup d'etat of May 1960, led by Colonel Alparslan Türkeş, armed soldiers surrounded the Dergah, smashed Said's tomb, and removed his body to an unknown location. These are the bare facts that set me off on a journey. It was to be a journey across Anatolia, following in the footsteps of Said Nursi, and a journey into time to search for the spiritual roots of this exceptional man. It took me from the mountains that tower above the village of Nurs in the Toros Range to Van, Bitlis, Diyarbakir, Mardin, Damascus, and far beyond. And although I did not know it at the time, it was to be a personal journey toward Islam. All of that is introduction to this brief presentation, which I call Beginnings and Endings. 15 years ago, I wrote a book about Turkey called Anatolia Junction. In that book, I took Said Nursi's death at Urfa as a beginning. For me, as a writer, the event captured my attention. What was it about this man, so long a prisoner without financial resources and political power, that made the perpetrators of the coup d'etat so afraid of him? 12 years later, in 2011, I published a memoir called Then We Were One, which has just now appeared in Turkish. This time, instead of beginning at the end, I began at the very beginning, my childhood in a tiny corner of Southern California. But this memoir also ends with a beginning, with my acceptance of Islam. Here it is appropriate for me to express my thanks to my publisher, Nesil Yayınları, which 2 years ago agreed to publish my book. I must also pay tribute to my dear and devoted younger brothers, Metin Karabaşoğlu, Abdullah Taha Orhan, and Akif Memmi, whose efforts and confidence are today rewarded. I cannot thank them enough. As those of you who will read it will soon learn, and I hope many of you will soon read it, this book is not only about life and beginning, it is also about death and ending. In fact, the two are closely connected, as I will soon demonstrate, calling upon the wisdom of the Risale-i. This book tells not only my story, that of the survivor who lives to tell the tale, it also tells the story of my late and younger brother, who brought his life to an end. For decades, I struggled to understand why he had done so. I could not. I wanted to know if there had been a fatal flaw in our family history. Quickly, I ruled that out. Our mother and father were loving parents who strived for what they thought was best for their sons: health, happiness, a good education, and lives as responsible citizens. But the temper of the times was against them. Over the horizon, like storm clouds gathering on a fine sunny day, loomed the war in Vietnam. That war was to destroy our family as it destroyed the moral fiber of our country and transformed it into what it has become today. It was the Vietnam War and the inhuman logic of that war that killed my brother, I finally concluded. What a sorrowful conclusion. He did not die in combat in the name of the false principles that the United States never fail to invoke. No, he died of his own hand, as if turning the knife of the killers against him. Our parents were gentle and peaceful. They hated violence, but they insisted we join the army and fight against people who had never invaded our country nor harmed us in any way. I am alive and sitting here before you today as an old man because I disobeyed them and left the United States, never to return. The American Army in the 1960s was an army of conscripts. My brother was soon drafted and sent to Vietnam along with hundreds of thousands of young Americans. There, as a medical photographer, he witnessed atrocities committed by the American army against a people that sought only its national independence and had invaded no one. In Vietnam, as in Iraq 40 years later, millions of innocents died. The guilty were never punished. Even today, they strut back and forth across the world stage in their uniforms and their expensive suits, issuing commands and ordering submissions, saying, so-and-so must go. They are vain, haughty, and arrogant. They are everything, they say, and we are nothing. Alhamdulillah, better we be nothing, for there is no blood on our hands. "16 years after the Vietnam War ended and the US Army had been defeated, in a farmhouse in a small town in New Zealand, my brother brought his life to an end. The act was a brutal one. He had issued a death sentence against himself, and there was to be no appeal. Yes, God is the ultimate disposer of all affairs, but nothing spares us the obligation to seek out their proximate causes, to find them, point to them, and warn against them. For the ways in which the Creator manifests his sovereign will in the world are never clear and visible, always indirect, taking the form of natural laws and expressed in the relationship of cause and effect, which Sayyid Nursi describes as God's artistry. Even though my brother was profoundly innocent and had killed no one, I am certain that as a man of conscience, he felt deep guilt for what our countrymen had done in Vietnam. Guilt for the massacres and the atrocities, and for those crimes he could not atone. In Washington, D.C., there is a monument to the American soldiers who died in Vietnam. More than 50,000 names are inscribed there on a low, curving granite wall. But there is no monument to those who killed themselves, even though their number is perhaps as great. You may take "Then We Were One" as a small personal memorial. You may take it as a cry of alarm, as an appeal for redemption, and a call for justice. You may also take the sad event it relates as something more, as a sharp break and a beginning. These are things that cannot always be seen or understood at the time they happen. Often years must pass before the meaning of things come into view. Just as our understanding of the Risale-i grows deeper as we read, so our understanding of life grows as we examine it and look back upon it. Such is God's infinite wisdom in inscribing our lives in the flux of time. 30 years later, as I wrote the story of our two lives, I was able to see that the shock of my brother's death had redirected my life. I quit my job and departed for Iran, where Islamic revolutionaries had overthrown the corrupt regime of the Shah. That was the beginning of my career as a journalist and my first encounter with political Islam. What communists and socialists and Democrats had been unable to achieve, the determined masses of people led by an elderly man of religion accomplished. Ayatollah Khomeini proclaimed to the Iranian people, "Your religious duty is to go out into the streets and God will give the result." They did, and he did. Several years later, when I came to Turkey, I naively expected to find a similar situation. But there was no Ayatollah Khomeini in Turkey, no doctrine of Velayat-e Faqih that would allow a religious scholar to rule the state. Instead, there was Bediüzzaman Sayyid Nursi. Of course, his religious views sprang from the same sources, but his life had been radically different. And unlike Khomeini, he had turned his back on power. As you can imagine, it took me some time to understand this and to appreciate it. Not only was the end of Sayyid Nursi's life in Urfa a beginning for me, it was in a sense a greater beginning. After a lifetime of hardship, exile, house arrest, and imprisonment, Sayyid was finally liberated from all earthly bounds. For Sayyid teaches that although life ends in death, it is not destruction or nothingness or annihilation. Just as a seed superficially dies and rots while inside it a shoot is being kneaded and coming to life, that is, it is passing from the particular life of a seed to the universal life of a shoot, so too, although death is apparently disintegration and banishment, in reality for human beings, it is the title, introduction, and starting point of perpetual life. By applying Sayyid's argument symbolically, we could say that his death marked the passing of a particular life to become a reflection of perpetual life here on earth. Among men. The green shoot of the Risale-i is today growing and flourishing in the hearts of his loyal students. The words beginning and ending can also be raised to a higher level still. We see reflected in the wisdom of the Risale-i all creatures unceasingly flowing by divine permission in the river of time. They are being sent from the world of the unseen. They are being clothed with external existence in the manifest world. Then they are being poured in orderly fashion into the world of the unseen. And it is there that they alight. At their sustainer''s command, they continuously come from the future, stop by in passing for a breath, and are poured into the past. In Anatolia Junction, which began in Urfa at the empty grave, I concluded my narrative of Sayyid Nursi's life in Barla, where the Risale-i Nur, like a green shoot, had burst forth. There I reflected on how exile and imprisonment had, paradoxically, liberated Sayyid. For it was there among modest farmers and fishermen that he dictated at high speed the Quranic commentary that today is his legacy. What was emerging then in Turkey like a green shoot was belief, the cornerstone of Sayyid's legacy. And what was and is fading away was militant secularism, the system designed to cut off the peoples of Turkey from their centuries-long religious inheritance. Islam has two parallel histories. The first is a spiritual one, beginning with the revelation to our noble Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and continuing through the great scholars, scientists, philosophers, poets, historians, and spiritual masters who created a world civilization and shaped a universal and ethical heritage. Sayyid Nursi surely numbers among them and can be seen as one of those reformers and defenders of Islam who are reputed to visit the world every 100 years. The second history is that of the events, the proximate causes that weighed upon our spiritual tradition. These events comprise the wars of conquest, the battles, the disorders, and the struggles for dynastic succession that set the seal of arbitrary authority on the Muslim world. For Islam to reassert itself as the center of universal values, it must reject arbitrary authority in any form. Neither majority Sunnis nor minority Shia have been spared. Among both, unscrupulous men have created state systems that unleashed destructive energy. They have manipulated religion to accommodate their drive for power, wealth, and domination. They have used their power to create systems of jurisprudence from which the divine is absent. My esteemed colleague Colin Turner put it this way: Islam without Allah. Sayyid Nursi's remarkable achievement has been to restore the absolute primacy of God, to insist on and recognize two revealed sources of belief, the created universe and the sublime Quran, and to link them to the human conscience. These make up what Sayyid terms the macrocosm, the universal framework in which divine will works its ways, just as the author's pen moves across the page. Within it lie millions and millions of microcosms, the seeds and the green shoots, the lives and deaths that make up our infinitesimal part of the river of time. Among these tiny worlds, these microcosms, are our lives, our beginnings and our endings, our striving and our writing, our birth and our death.